This is Counterpoint.
Welcome to the November 21st edition of Counterpoint. I'm Joshua Goodman, and I'm joined by Daniel Schwammenthal of the AJC Transatlantic Institute, Roland Freudenstein of the Center for European Studies, and he's probably still listening in his car on the way over, but Jan Techau should be here.
I think he's taking public transportation.
Then he's listening on his iPad app.
No product
iTunes app, whatever it is. Maybe he's an Android person. We're glad to be back after a 1 week hiatus. It's actually nice to see both of your smiling faces here in the studio.
And by the way, my voice sounds, I need some chicken soup.
Oh, our loyal listener is probably chuckling to herself right now. Excellent. Thank you, Roland. The top story this week, well, the top story probably should be the ongoing European Council summit aimed at setting the EU budget for the next 7 years and the tackling of Greece's debt. Daniel's already asleep.
Yeah, I hear some snoring.
Yeah. He's getting old, what can I tell you? But that would...
Aren't we all?
I was born old.
Ageism,
exactly. We are politically correct show, Daniel.
Old and wise.
I'm trying to be serious here,
Okay,
people.
no,
We've
okay,
got
come on.
news. We've got story.
You're wearing a Viva la Reagan Revolution t-shirt. I mean, this is...
It's a very serious
serious
political statement
Should
about the
turn
Reagan
around and show
Revolution.
your T-shirt to the camera.
I don't think anyone watches on the camera.
Yeah. Okay, so...
We would talk about the European Council summit, but that would require an actual decision or announcement, and surprise, surprise, nothing has happened. In the absence of that, we'll turn east, and to the Middle East more specifically, where events continue to unfold in Israel and Gaza. Speculation over a possible ceasefire earlier today was overshadowed by a terror attack on a bus in central Tel Aviv. The bomb, which reports suggest was placed on the bus by a perpetrator who then fled before detonation, has left at least 21 injured. The organization responsible for the bombing, if it was an organization itself, has not yet been determined, but Hamas has welcomed the aggression and given it its blessings, which is probably telling enough. As the conflict enters its second week, and with reports now, we can prepare all we want for the show, but breaking news can kind of turn it on its end. With reports now that there may well be a ceasefire announcement of some sort at 8 o'clock, and we can get into the details a little sooner. But Daniel, I'd like your impression of the attack today. You know, when you heard about it, did you anticipate that this was going to be, maybe an escalation? A further escalation into a much more elaborate conflict, or was this something that you could have been a momentary blip?
Well, as it now turns out, with the announcement now, I think it's now clear that we have a ceasefire agreement.
Is it official?
It looks official. The Egyptian foreign minister made a formal announcement in a joint press conference with Clinton. But the bus attack, of course, was a shock. We've almost forgotten that those suicide bombing, it turned out it wasn't a suicide bombing, but bomb attacks, particularly on buses and other crowded areas, were once a daily feature almost in the early 2000s. And it was then only thanks to a reoccupation, so to speak, of the West Bank, at least for a limited period.
And the wall, the security fence.
And the security fence is so vilified here in Europe that put an end to it. But of course, you can never, completely turn the country into, secure the country. It only takes one successful attempt.
So then we have this attempt, and let's actually let's take it out of the context of the larger conflict that's been going on. Let's look at it in an isolated incident. It is the first bombing of a bus in over 5 years. It's the first terror attack in Israel in more than a year. Are there going to be questions asked about the security services? Will there be? Is there reason to be concerned that more attacks could be coming? Because clearly there's at least some vulnerability that this said terrorist was able to expose.
Well, I mean, we still don't know enough about it. There were some reports indicating that it may have been a lone terrorist, that he may not actually be linked to any organization. We will soon find out if there were, security lapses. But if it was indeed a lone terrorists, then it's sort of a relatively new situation that security services here in Europe face, I think, more often.
And in the United States as well. But arguably they pose a greater danger.
Exactly, because you can't really, you may have good intelligence on the known organizations and cells and so forth. But I think at this stage we should not over-dramatize. I think they seem to have the situation as, with respect to the West Bank and Gaza, preventing real infiltrators and coming into the heartland of Israel, I think is a relatively under control. Of course, there's never 100% security, but I don't think it's going to ever again present a sort of really strategic challenge it did in the early 2000s.
Roland, what do you make of the terrorist attack?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that I think the weapon of choice for Hamas and Islamic Jihad are still the missiles. Yeah. And we really need to talk about the effects of that and the different aspects of that problem, because there were some new developments in this conflict, right? I mean, rockets reaching Tel Aviv, reaching Jerusalem, and for several days. It was not like with a few hundred individual air attacks, Israel could entirely stop rocket fire over these long ranges. No. And I think that was one of the reasons, one of the main goals of Hamas in this conflict is to sustain long-range rocket fire despite intense Israeli air and sea attacks, and that is many people talked about Hamas crossed a red line in the hours after it happened, but I mean it's definitely a new quality to the conflict. If not only the south and the north, if not only the south is vulnerable to Hamas and people from Gaza, and the north is vulnerable.
I want to return to the objectives question a little later, probably in the next segment, but with the report of the ceasefire, since we don't have the details precisely, we have speculation on them. What is either side looking for or should they be looking for in an agreement? Because both, presumably, since there's no clear-cut winner and loser in this in the battle so far, what should either side seems likely to get some sort of benefit from it, some sort of concession from the other. So what should each side be looking for right now, Roland?
Well, I think for Hamas, it's pretty clear besides shoring up their own power base in Gaza itself, they want an end to the airstrikes and to the shelling from the sea. They want an end to the targeted killings of military leaders, what they call military leaders, which is top terrorists for me. And they want a lifting, not an easing of the blockade.
And what do you think they're likely to get here?
I think they get the first two, but not the third.
You think they'll get an end to targeted assassinations?
But I mean, the first two demands are, of course, Israel only now decided to air attacks and target assassination as a reaction to the escalation of
targeted assassinations took place.
Haven't been.
They took place before. It's been a policy they've used.
Years and years.
It was largely before 2008.
It have been years.
But it's still a method they've used and continuously over the years.
Well, but they haven't used it in many years. So the idea to put this on the table it's an easy victory, because Israel can say, well, as long as you don't fire anything, we will not target your leadership either, and we will not feel necessary to. So,
but it's also important to talk about what the Israelis want out of this. I mean, they want not only an end to the missile fire. I think they clearly want some kind of control over or prevention of smuggling of new weapon systems into Gaza, which has developed quite elaborate routes since the
do they want control?
Morsi.
Do they want control themselves? Do they want Hamas? Do they want Egypt?
They know they can't have it.
Responsibility?
I think if I were Israeli, I would say that realistically speaking, I would like some kind of international force. But this is not going to happen. The U.S. No one will let the U.S. do that.
But Israel's also the first one to be skeptical about international forces. Lebanon being the example they'll always put forth and some of their advocates.
It depends on what forces, but I think
it depends on the mandate.
I mean, what we've seen happening here is we've talked about it earlier. Egypt has lost a little bit control over Sinai, and this is a development that started already under Mubarak. And the situation escalated that to an extent that I think it was the summer in August that Al-Qaeda and perhaps elements even linked to Hamas attacked an Egyptian military post and killed 16 Egyptian soldiers. In reaction to that, there have been reports in the Israeli press that the Egyptian army has now cracked down on these tunnels and the smuggling, etc., much harder than they used to under Mubarak. So I think it is in a lot of people talk about that Hamas is now in a better position because the Muslim Brotherhood is now in power in Cairo, and they are basically from the same family, so they get support. I'm not so sure this is necessarily true because the Muslim Brotherhood is under a lot of pressure, financially, economically. It needs help from the West, and it doesn't want to see an escalation in Gaza because it puts itself in a very uncomfortable position. Ideologically, it would be sort of required to support Hamas actively, but it can't do that. It can't break the peace treaty on that. So it wants Hamas to be quiet. So there is a much greater self.
But the links between Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood were never entirely active. There was an ideological connection at some point, but they were not
I'm
directly.
But they could continue portrayed in the media, and that's how it's also being felt among the people and among the leadership. There is an active component. So nobody ever expected Mubarak to come in and fight on Hamas side against Israel. But there is pressure on the street much more if there is a flare-up in violence between Hamas and Israel for the Muslim Brotherhood to do more than just rhetoric support. And that puts it in a difficult position.
But let's return to the concessions that Israel wants, because Roland, you pointed to one thing, but it's unclear how they would get it and who would give it. What are they looking for? What's the key component that they need in a ceasefire?
They want securities, guarantees that Hamas does not rearm to the extent of armament that they had before this conflict started.
How do you do that?
I'm saying this is a political goal.
Yeah.
I'm sure they had assurances before that. Even from the Mubarak government still, that Hamas would not be able to at least use these medium-range missiles. So in a sense. Frankly speaking, I don't know how technically and in detail politically Israel imagines this control mechanism to be, but they are not going to sign or declare a ceasefire without having some kind of assurance that Hamas will not be able to replace its weapon systems so quickly.
And my point is that I think that cooperation, as counterintuitive as it may sound, cooperation under a Muslim Brotherhood government in suppressing the smuggling could be greater than under Mubarak, because the Muslim Brotherhood, as I said, I think is in a much more uncomfortable situation when violence flares up than Mubarak. For Mubarak, having violence between Israel and Palestine was always sort of a good diversion, whereas for the Muslim Brotherhood, it puts it domestically under much greater strain. So they would like to avoid it have a much greater stake in avoiding a conflict to start.
They certainly want more control over the Sinai for their own national interests. The question is whether they can get it, because the situation has gotten so out of hand, particularly in their early years. And even if they do cooperate together, smugglers are still smugglers. They always find a way to bypass. And this is a big open desert. It's not exactly exactly an easy
thing. To Gaza is
you just dig a tunnel. So a tunnel can be dug anywhere along that very long border.
Like with everything, you can't suppress everything 100%, but I'm sure there is more that they can do.
But we're gonna look at now, assuming that the ceasefire does go through at 9 o'clock tonight, as it's now being reported. We're gonna look at the take a retrospective and look at the actual conflict and see did either side actually achieve their goals. We'll be right back after this break. Please stay with us. You're listening to Counterpoint. Welcome back to Counterpoint. Continuing on our discussion from before the break. What were, Roland, what were Hamas's objectives here? And did they achieve them? Because you mentioned that.
You mean in the military sense, right?
Well, but we have to look at it from both angles. Let's start with military for both Hamas and Israel, but I want to get to the political as well. Yes, of course.
Well, I think Hamas wants to show that it can persist under severe attack, that it can sustain, and is still able to reach more targets in Israel than in the last conflagration. Which was the end of 2008, which they successfully achieved. From the purely military Hamas point of view, that part was a success, and for Israel it is quite an ominous thing. Now, the next point, of course, is the allegedly changed political landscape in the Middle East with after the Arab Spring, with democratically elected Islamist governments in Egypt and Tunisia and possibly other countries in future. Hamas wanted to make a big show of solidarity. It wanted to orchestrate solidarity by other Arab governments that they have never gotten out of the previous regimes.
And of course, you saw the Qatari government, which is now bankrolling them, jump up and be very vocal in support.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's the amazing thing. That it's not only the classical Islamist governments, but a couple of others too. I mean, Qatar is not Muslim Brotherhood ruled.
But then politically, that ties into the political thing. Are they trying to establish themselves as the more powerful leader of the Palestinian people?
Yeah. Absolutely, it's of course it's direct. This is directed towards Abbas, and it's a show of strength, and it's not the first show of strength. I mean, they've been kind of trying to gain the upper hand vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank for some time already.
Okay, and did you think they made gains there?
I think they made some progress.
Now, Daniel, from the Israeli perspective, what was their objective militarily when they responded?
Well, I mean, obviously, is that after this escalation, their objective was to reintroduce this element of deterrence and take out at least most of their long-range missiles that can reach Tel Aviv. And it's supposedly, apparently, I mean, obviously they haven't eliminated all of them, but according to media reports, according to the IDF, they have succeeded already in the very first days to decimate that arsenal.
You talk about 90% of the Fajr the Fajr 5.
But as we learned with Lebanon a few years earlier, restocking is not the most difficult thing. It can be done.
I mean, wait a minute. The bigger the bigger the range of the rockets, the more difficult it is actually to smuggle them.
Right.
I mean, Fajr 5 is like 7 meters long. Mm-hmm. The ramp on which it's launched is 10 meters long. You can't hide that in an average-sized truck. I mean, even if you take it into 2 or 3 pieces, it's not so easy.
Those missiles through the tunnels again, and assuming that perhaps Egypt will at least beef up a little bit their patrols,
exactly.
will make it all more difficult. Of course, not impossible, and arms smuggling will continue, but I mean, it will take them some time to restock, that's for sure.
So then the deterrence, Daniel, you made the deterrence, but did they meet that objective? Because, as Roland said, Hamas proving its military might, its ability to reach further, and perhaps it's also its political objectives at home, seems to have been victorious in that regard. So, Daniel, do you think the deterrence was established?
I think deterrence was established because both sides. I mean, Israel had no. I think it was clear from the beginning, and I think Prime Minister Netanyahu played his cards very well. He had no real intention to go inside with ground troops. He always, from the beginning, said if we can avoid it, we would prefer diplomatic solution and avoid it without doing it. And so I think after they sort of like depleted their target bank, it was clear that Israel was now interested in the ceasefire, and Hamas as well. They have taken. I mean, of course, they're going to sell it as a big victory. They've reached Tel Aviv, etc. etc. But I mean, in a more rational, normal view of the world, you look at it and you see that they have depleted their rockets. They have 60, 70 of their fighters killed. Some of their best minds, so to speak. There is great devastation. Parliamentary buildings, offices have been destroyed.
Police
administration. I mean, any normal Palestinian should be looking around and thinking, was that really worth it? And probably come to the conclusion it wasn't.
But has that ever been the case over the history of the
well,
conflict?
Well, you're
speaking rationally, but
yeah,
you're looking at it from a German sitting in Brussels looking at it from afar. Think about it in the Palestinian mindset. Does the concept of we should never do this again even get in there? I'm not so sure.
We don't know. I mean, there is a sort of, it would be scary if to believe that really the entire Palestinian population in Gaza stands rock solid behind these senseless attacks against Israel that will only result in greater devastation in their own country.
But again, you're looking, when you use the word senseless there, you're looking at it from the wrong perspective.
We can't know. They rule with iron fist. It's not an open and free society. There is no Gallup going around and asking, what do you think about the latest Hamas escalation? We don't know. We can only assume that there are many people there that cannot support a situation where their houses and neighborhoods are destroyed.
But the mass celebrations on the street after the bombing in Tel Aviv might be an indication otherwise.
Mass celebrations, how many were there in the end? There's 1.5 million people. I haven't actually seen the television broadcast, but if there were more than a few dozens, I would be surprised. So, as I said, it's hard to say what the people on the street think in Gaza. They live under an iron fist.
But talking about Israeli interests, I mean, let's just go in reverse and look at the situation a week ago. What Hamas was actually trying to do was to slowly increase the frequency of rocket attacks on the south of Israel, and actually to push the Israeli military off the northern border so they could dig tunnels in order to send commandos through to capture Israeli soldiers. Yeah. Which, as we have seen in the case of Gilad Shalit, it can turn into an enormous asset for Hamas. And Israel was watching this, was seeing this happen, and had a choice. I mean, actually had to determine the point in time when they would have to stop this. And that brings me to the famous dictum of trimming the beard. I think it's in a way, it's both sides that feel that they probably have to regularly go through this kind of ordeal in order to reestablish a situation and have calm for a couple of years. At least that's Israel's way of looking at it. Whereas Hamas wants to slowly, by using different roads and methods, but wants to shift the situation in its own favor vis-a-vis Israel.
So establish a new normal.
Exactly.
It used to be one rocket per month was acceptable, then one rocket per week, etc. But one more thing that I wanted to add, I think there is one more element I haven't seen anywhere, and that is Iran. I could
they proudly announced that they're officially arming Hamas this morning, which they always have denied.
Clearly, Israel's response was made necessary by the escalation from Hamas over the last week, but this operation serves also, I think, a second purpose. Should it come to a military attack on Iran by either the United States or Israel, the fear was always, will Iran use its Hamas and Hezbollah proxies to attack Israel? Now, having now depleted much of their, or 90% even of the long-range missiles, and taken out many more, and reestablishing a level of deterrence, I think that is possibly also a preparation for a military confrontation with Iran.
And it was a great test for Iron Dome, the missile defense system, which was tried out for the first time in a massive situation.
Reaching
and
90% success rate.
It passed the test with flying colors.
I want to, just before we end this segment, I want to go back to one point you made, which is establishing the new norm. And that begs the question. We had a military confrontation. There was a truce in which both sides are going to claim victory. How does this in any way resolve or affect the long-term solution to the conflict? Is that and you're both shaking your heads, people on the radio can't see that, but is that because the solution actually is a political one? And that brings a further question, when we'll find out the details of how this was negotiated, but if Israel was negotiating directly with Hamas, is that the next step to trying to find a long-term solution to this?
I don't, frankly speaking, I really don't see a political solution to this conflict in the foreseeable future.
That's a cop-out. Foreseeable future is a cop-out.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
come on.
Okay. But listen. As long as Hamas does not recognize Israel, I'm not even saying Israel as a state of the Jewish people. I'm saying Israel. As long as they can't even bring themselves to use the term Israel, I don't see a political solution of the whole conflict. We're going to have ceasefires. The ceasefires are going to work better or worse, but I don't see any immediate perspective in the next 5 years, say, of this conflict ending, because the amount of mistrust on both sides is so tremendous that there won't be more than a ceasefire.
I would say that we have two Palestinian regimes and therefore also two Palestinian conflicts. The traditional way of negotiate a two-state solution, the peace process, I think is in theory still sort of alive when it comes to the West Bank and negotiating with Abbas, where in theory a land for peace deal is still possible. But should it ever come to such a deal, it will have no effect, in my view, or no immediate effect on what's going on in Hamas, where we have a completely separate regime which is ideologically committed to Israel's destruction. So there is no way that it's not about territory, it's about it's an existential conflict. So
I want to ask you about the in theory, but I won't, because we have to move on we have to take a break and move on to our next subject, which ties into the comment on Fatah. And I want to explore, when we get back from this music break, where is Fatah in all of this? And how do they come out of it? So we're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. Please stay with us, and you're listening to Counterpoint. Welcome back to Counterpoint. I've been watching a lot of the coverage of the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and one thing that stuck out for me is how it's being framed. It continues to be framed, even when you look at the coverage of the reported ceasefire, specifically as it relates to the players. And by that I mean this. Often the fighting is being defined as a conflict between Israel and Hamas, not Israel and the Palestinians, which raises an interesting question. Where does Fatah fall in all of this, Roland?
Fatah is in a difficult position. It has been for some time. There were after 5 days, there were some street demonstrations in solidarity with Gaza. There was some violence with Israeli police and military, but I think Fatah has lost on a couple of fronts, relatively speaking. Economically, it's not going that well anymore in the West Bank, especially now with a big financial help from Qatar and other Arab actors for Gaza. Politically,
Qatar's also investing in the West Bank as well.
Yeah, but they don't make such a political show out of it.
Right.
And it doesn't seem like anyone in the Arab world is really, really keen on talking to Fatah and appearing on television with them. So I think politically they're getting more isolated, where Hamas is breaking new ground in getting Arab recognition, especially by democratically elected governments. And last but not least, of course, Fatah, they went to the UN with this independence bid, the Declaration of Sovereignty bid last year. It kind of it didn't backfire, but it didn't work out.
Officially, it didn't fail because they never put it to a vote, but they never succeeded in their objective either. Yes.
This is a big dent, and of course they're going to try something else.
Well, yes, no, I want to get to that. So they're going reportedly on November 29th to the UN General Assembly to request an upgrade of their status to non-member observer state.
Yeah,
that will pass. that's the
that will
presumption
pass,
because
but it's
the
not
vote.
it's not the smashing.
It's not the same
success
thing.
that they had hoped
But
for.
it gives
last
them
year.
most of the prerogative that they would have thought, like they could in theory go into the
So
international
let me ask you this.
criminal court.
From two angles. One, the conflict has made very clear the divide between Fatah and Hamas. How does that affect? Because when we're looking at the votes, really the focus is on Europe to see how they fall on the UNJ thing. How does that at all affect Europe? And number two, does the overall conflict in which Europe came out very strongly, for the most part, in support of on an individual level, in support of Israel, and then in the council conclusions, the EU spoke as one, using the term right to self-defense. How does that factor into this? Does it at all? Will this have a positive impact? Will it cause some Europeans to perhaps do the calculus that I saw a unofficial Fatah representative being interviewed on BBC today, and the BBC presenter asked the question, you don't even have control of your own state. How do you want to be upgraded to a full state? I mean, you're not even a full state, a unified state anymore. So will this have any impact on the UN process?
I think it can go either way. I think that some governments will make the argument that this BBC presenter made. I mean, if how can you ask?
He just asked a question. The BBC doesn't make a point.
If one of the characteristics of a state is that the government has full sovereignty over the entire territory, and obviously we have a divided government. So it doesn't. Fatah doesn't have control over Gaza, or if it claims it has, then it would be responsible for the horrendous war crimes committed just by.
They're walking around reminding everyone of the coup d'état. The coup d'état that
right.
Hamas.
So that's one way. On the other hand, I'm sure Abbas is now going around and saying, "Look, you really need to support me because I cannot be upstaged by Hamas. You need to strengthen me in this fight between those radicals and us, the moderates. So if let me hang, it will seal my fate, and Hamas will take power in the West Bank as well." So I'm not sure how governments will respond to this.
I recall from last year when the official declaration of statehood was submitted, or at least the process at the UNGA General Assembly, the opening of it, there were a lot of statements saying that Abbas really didn't want to go through with it, but he had sort of been cornered into it, and that the international community, the manner in which they had handled the situation over the past year or so, had really left him with no other choice to pursue it. I'm thinking completely theoretically here. Had this conflict with Israel and Gaza persisted, or Israel and Hamas, would this have been the perfect cover for him to back down again, to say now's not the right time, and he could have avoided what will be a successful request, but the ramifications could be entirely negative for him?
Nice idea. Nice thought, but
I don't know how to say what.
Maybe he'll shoot some rockets.
He could still, if he's smart, he would still use this as an excuse to at least postpone it. I think it's. I don't think it's fair to say that he was in any way cornered or outmaneuvered. He painted himself into this corner instead of coming to the negotiating table. He decided to, refuse negotiations and then go for this UN bid, which will have the opposite effect of what he's trying to achieve. So, I pity the Palestinians because of their not only divided leadership, but look at the choices they have. On the one hand, Hamas. I don't think we need to say anything more. On the other hand, Abbas, who instead of building a state is going for this diplomatic maneuver.
I think we've exhausted this topic, so just one last question. We always look at Israel's perception in the world, and as a conflict persists, it tends to decrease, and they started very positively. How do you think they come out of this, and what do you attribute it to?
Well, first of all, Israel, there was surprising support for Israel from several places in the world where I wouldn't have expected it.
Is that because Hamas overplayed their hand?
I think that one thing is the Hamas factor, but I think a bigger factor is just smart Israeli diplomacy and political communication, and they really played it well this time. I think this is one of the classical examples where you may argue that the time is working against Israel, but Israel learns from its past mistakes. And that not only goes for the military, that also goes for communication and for policy. And I think phone calls were made to European leaders saying that, look, we are now even more politically isolated in the Middle East itself. You've got the Brotherhood-led governments in Tunisia, Egypt, and parties in a couple of other countries now declaring their full solidarity with Hamas. Now, please help us, because we are facing a much more difficult political environment. I think this argument has played a role, for example, in a phone call between Netanyahu and Frau Merkel in Berlin. And I think that we all know that the atmosphere would have tipped over if there had been a ground operation in Gaza. But since Israel probably stops short of that, I think Israel PR-wise looks pretty good for the moment.
And he also plays the card well by holding the threat, and saying, we don't want to do this. Yeah. We don't want to do a ground. So please use your good offices to stop it.
So was this a significant victory for Israel then on a PR level?
Yeah, and the social media were played extremely well this time.
No. I mean, given the circumstances, this couldn't have gone better. I mean, there's still, of course, a lot of criticism, but...
Well, despite that positive last note, it's still a very dangerous and a very sad situation, as a lot of people suffered over the course of the past week, and no end in sight on the long haul. So we will obviously continue to watch that story, and hopefully we will have that ceasefire at 9 o'clock tonight. We're going to turn to a definitely more positive story when we come back from this break. You're listening to Counterpoint. Welcome back to Counterpoint. Last month, the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for, among other reasons, its role in leading the countries of Eastern Europe down the path of democracy. One would be remiss, however, if they didn't also note the influence of admission to NATO in that process. Well, today we mark the 10th anniversary of NATO extending an invitation of membership to Slovenia, Bulgaria, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Romania at the now famous Prague conference. Roland, how impactful was the idea of NATO membership in the democratic transformations of these countries and others in Europe?
I think it can't be overestimated. It was extremely important for freedom to take roots in those countries, and for them to actually develop the self-confidence and the maneuvering space to be constructive contributors then to most of them are also in the European Union. It gave. I mean, I think here NATO membership and EU membership are two sides of the same coin. Right. These were the two decisive Euro-Atlantic institutions which these countries had to join in order to irreversibly Westernize themselves.
So it was less about being part of a strong military alliance; it's more about being part of a club and sitting at the same table as everyone else.
And in the case of some countries, the NATO membership sent particularly important signals to Russia.
And also to the EU. A lot of countries entered NATO before they got into the EU, if I'm not mistaken. So it was almost a stepping stone to the final objective. Do you still think NATO holds that appeal today? Or has it changed in its mission
NATO is looking for
NATO is
looking for a mission.
But do you think
we all agree on that?
But do you think people still desire to be a part of it? Maybe for military purposes, but do you still military cooperation with the West?
Yes,
and is that an angle?
Of course, military cooperation is there, but to an extent, NATO has, at least in the European neighborhood, NATO has exhausted the potential, so to speak.
Right.
I mean, there were these two potential new accession candidates with Georgia and Ukraine, and both of them, for different reasons and with completely different domestic background, but both of them have completely turned away from NATO membership.
And Belarus has never even been close.
And Belarus has kind of never considered that. It's true. But seriously speaking, I think NATO enlargement is not the real question anymore. We may discuss about the Western Balkans and so on, but what is important for NATO, of course, is now, and here enters Jan Techau, and he will have to say a few words
in 1 minute or less
on the future of NATO. Jan,
do you
come on, sit down.
You really have a good 2 minutes to offer us your deepest insights, but do you think Do you think NATO still holds the appeal that it did back in the transfer? I'm going to ask a long question. He is winded. Do you think NATO still holds the same appeal as it did 10 years ago when it brought in the countries of Eastern Europe? Does it still hold that attraction, perhaps for different reasons? I'm thinking more military cooperation with between southern neighborhood and or North Africa, Israel as well. Does it still hold some level of attraction to countries and therefore possess that same power to influence democratic reform and respect for human rights that it did 10 years ago when it was helping Eastern Europe along that transformation?
Sorry, guys, for being late, and sorry for being slightly out of breath.
It just means you'll answer quickly.
The transformative power, no. There's not the same number of candidates out there, and there's not the same kind of need for this kind of transformative power, even though you could argue that there may be one or two countries still out there. But overall, that power is basically gone and spent, if you will. It still holds the Article 5 attraction as a reserve insurance company for security
and
threats.
Article 5 being, for our listeners, it means that if a NATO member is attacked, NATO has to defend it.
And it still has a certain kind of flexibility in providing security services to Europe that no other organization can. We've seen this in the Libya case. This is a long debate, obviously. But in the European security market, there are really only two organizations that can provide security. One is the EU, the other one is NATO. And guess who's the winner in this game?
But it seems the EU then, conversely, has won the political battle and become the political target when looking at Ukraine, even Georgia and some other countries when you know.
Yeah, but that has always been the division of labor, basically, between the two organizations. They're both part of the same kind of pacifying scheme for Europe. And depending on what kind of need is there in the European market, one or the other is being invoked. And at the moment, it's a boring neighborhood, Europe. And so the Americans attach less value to it. We have the Balkans out there. They're less boring than the rest of it. But, there's no immediate threat anymore. And the Americans consider this to be, done, checked.
I don't know. I think my journalist friends who were sitting in the European Council building at 5 a.m. this morning waiting for a press conference on the fate of Europe might say it's a bit exciting, though. One of them posted a picture of herself knitting a scarf. So perhaps she's...
It's still interesting in economic terms, unfortunately, but not in military terms.
Yeah.
It's very interesting what people get excited about.
But we were just excited that you could join us. But unfortunately,
I'm so stupid. I'm an hour late. That's all there is to it.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you, Roland. Thank you, Daniel. And Jan, you really put the cherry on top of the show. It really was
A+ for effort.
On top of the ice cream.
Yeah, you've really
what a show I must have missed.
You've completed the ice cream sundae indeed. Thank you, Eddie Sanfilippo in the background. We'll be back next Wednesday, same time, same channel. But if you miss it, our shows are now being archived on the AJC Transatlantic Institute's YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/user/AJC-TAI. So check them out there as well. Regular information for the show can also be found on the Institute's Facebook page, www.facebook.com/AJC-TAI. It's very nice of the Transatlantic Institute to let us borrow their social media apparatuses.
Can I borrow your T-shirt?
We've already talked about this.
Good.
And yes, you can.
Boy, what a show it must have been.
You can listen to it since you missed most of it on our YouTube channel tomorrow at about midday. Until next week, I'm Joshua Goodman for the entire team. Good night from Counterpoint.